So, at this time, I'd like to introduce our presenter for this evening, Mrs. Christina Mild. Many of us here tonight have been positively influenced by our relationship with Christina. Her knowledge about every aspect of native plants is exceptional, and so is her willingness to share this knowledge with others. Many of us know her as a mentor, as I do. She's a true educator, but Christina is also a great leader. Back in the late 90s, she transformed this Valley Nature Center from an old abandoned rec hall building full of junk and all kinds of living pests with 5 acres of mesquite and guinea grass out back. And she transformed that into a functioning nature center with an educational display area, a library, a gift shop, a meeting room, and that 5 acres was turned into an increasing array of diversity of native plants. So the Native Plant Project had its meetings there monthly in the only room that was air conditioned in the building with a rattling window unit. And Christina was there for the meetings and asked me one evening to volunteer to help in the gift shop. And I agreed. During that volunteer time, she introduced me to many interesting people who love nature and especially love native plants. These people like Bill McWhorter, who you see right here, Ken King, who's standing in the back. Mike Heap is somewhere around here. Front row, okay, Mike. And all of these people became my mentors and close friends. So I owe a debt of gratitude to Christina Mild, as I'm sure many of us do, for educating me and for leading me into a realm of nurturing kindred spirits who also educated me about the native plants. So she gave me a gift that just keeps on giving. So having said all those things, let's welcome our presenter for this evening, Christina Mild.
When Jan asked me if I could give some kind of presentation, I started looking through my list of PowerPoints I've done over the years, and I thought, well, I don't think I gave this one recently, this one on old botanical treasures. And when I looked at the first slide on it, I saw that I made it in 2005. So I reckoned that not too many people would remember. Well, if you heard me give it 20 years ago, you may not have remembered what was in it anyway. And I think there are quite a few of you here who were not even yet born in 2005. At the time I came up with this topic, it was due to Bill McWhorter. He was always telling me about these old books that had this super important information in them, right? And he would show them to me, and they had like maybe 5 pictures in the whole volume, hand-drawn, poor printing. To me, they just didn't seem all that exciting, so I was kind of confused about what he was talking about. At the time, I was doing a lot of writing. I was writing a column for the Valley Morning Star at the time that a lot of people still subscribed to a newspaper. My column was called Rio Delta Wild, and I was writing about native plants. Well, the people who knew me and knew I was writing that column, they'd say to me, okay, so what weed are you writing about this week, and how many thorns does it have on it? So I had to engage in some sensationalist journalism to get people's attention so that, first of all, they would read the column, and second of all, they might realize, oh, gee, this plant's in my backyard and it might actually be attracting this butterfly, or it might be feeding this little animal that I'm happy about seeing in my yard, like a certain bird. So Yeah, I was a sensationalist journalist. I had also been editing the Kiskadee for ACUS, and Bill McWhorter was coming over here to help me every day at the Valley Nature Center. Okay, so there's Bill McWhorter. At the time, most of the time, I was the only employee in the building. And we had all kind of characters coming to the Valley Nature Center. Some of them would say, hey, you know, which plants do you have growing out here that are hallucinogenic? Can you kind of give me a tour and show me? And apparently some of them were already using some of those substances, because one day I saw a guy jump from a standing start over our, like, I think it was at least a 6-foot fence. It may have been more than that. Okay, so there were some kind of rough characters coming around. So Bill would come and stay with me. He was, I guess he could have called the police. I don't think he could have punched anybody out, really, even if he tried. But he tried to help. So here's a bit of shared history between myself and Valley Nature Center. I was hired as a program director in the fall of 1996. And in my interview, I told them flat out, if your goal is to maintain the status quo around here, I am not the person for the job. Because I didn't want anybody complaining when I started changing things up, which is exactly what I did. You won't believe it, but I got crap when I dusted spider webs off the bottom of the chairs, right? That was something that we were not supposed to do, according to the only other person who worked here. So there was a mountain to climb in order to bring about those changes that Jan mentioned. They were behind the times by at least a decade. Well, I had a consultant assistant I brought in because what I was most interested in doing is educating young children. What are the birds, the special birds that live around here? What are the special plants that live around here? How do they depend upon each other? And for materials, I was having to look through Texas Parks and Wildlife, cut out pictures. I bought 3 postcards that actually had native birds on them at Santa Ana National Wildlife Refuge. There was almost nothing in terms of teaching materials. So most children around here, well, my assistant Courtney there, lying up there with her cat Peachy, she did a science fair project in probably 4th grade. She had pictures of the parrots, probably the red-crowned parrot, a green jay, a kiskadee, chachalaca, grackles, and a few other birds, okay? Most of those kids did not know the difference between a parrot and a green jay. And most of them could not pick out a kiskadee. They had no idea what a kiskadee was. So that's how are kids going to have value for something if they don't even know that that's what it is singing in their yard? So Courtney helped me a lot with figuring out ways that we could make children more aware of what was around them. And she had already been my assistant for Super Summer Science at St. Albans School, but she really kind of wanted to take a vacation instead of coming over here to work all summer. She's a very forthright person. And she remarked, Mom, there's these 2 old guys who've died recently, and you're doing the newsletter that one of them was doing, and now you're writing the article that the other one was doing. Do you think people might start getting suspicious? Well, neither one of them was a paying job, so there was no reason for the police to investigate me. So here are some of the activities that we came up with. And fortunately, the Valley Nature Center had a cadre of longtime volunteers. So one of the displays I liked the best was where this guy cut out nopales for me. And then we laminated and put Velcro on the fruits and the blooms. And we could tell the story about, okay, spring is coming, we're getting some rain, so what's going to happen on the nopales? Well, they're going to make flowers. And then what's going to happen? Well, they will get pollinated by the bees. Okay, so they're going to make fruits, so let's put on the fruits. And then children could hide underneath there, so they could learn that rabbits and a lot of other things could hide under prickly pears and be protected by from things like coyotes. So Courtney and I had a lot of fun, but it was an uphill climb because we had all these critters taking over the place, like the ants and the mice. Well, here's Bill McWhorter. I changed his name to William because I thought it was more respectful. On his birth certificate, it said Billy. Well, he's not like from the middle America, you know, hillbillies. Why his mom named him Billy, I have no idea. So I called him William. And what do you think he was doing to help me? Well, sometimes he was reading and rereading passages to me out of these books. I thought, I'm going to have to, well, you can see this book, maybe you can read it. It is from 1826 to 1834. I thought, I'm going to have to bring this guy forward more than a century here. So I'd kind of listen out of one ear while I was trying to get rid of all the pest and vermin. And then one day I realized he was reading me stories about the Indians. I was supposing it was cowboys and Indians because, you know, I grew up watching The Lone Ranger. And I knew nothing about the history of the Rio Grande Valley and the expeditions of various explorers, nothing. I was growing up in southern Illinois. So it took me almost 7 years to realize why Bill was reading to me out of that book, especially that particular passage. And this is what I think he was reading. He was reading about how these early explorers almost got caught by a band of Indians and how easily that the Amerindians who lived here could just disappear. They knew ways to get through the brush. And in one of the passages he read to me, if you ever go to Sable Palms and you see those huge swaths of vines that cover things, these explorers talked about how the Indians could just disappear into the forest. Well, when I look at those vines draping over things, I think, yeah, they were probably all kind of trails that they could follow back in there to disappear from these, you know, probing foreigners. Well, then I thought, well, no, why was he reading this to me, you know? What had I asked him? Well, we got a phone call at the Valley Nature Center. It was from somebody in the federal government, like EPA or something. And they wanted to know, could I supply them with some boats and take them down into the Rio Grande and show them some undisturbed areas of brush? We didn't even have enough money for one water hose, let alone boats and fuel and guides to take them onto the Rio Grande. So what Bill was trying to show me is that in order to know what we're trying to restore, we need to look in those oldest books where those early explorers described what was growing, where was it growing, and when. So he had very good reason to be reading from these old books and introducing me to them. So I thought, okay, I have never been to a pristine section of the Rio Grande, so what can I do? Well, my husband had a small plane. So I asked him, could you drive, can you take me on a ride over the Rio Grande? I want to go out towards like Salineno, Chapeno. And he says, oh, sure. He's always willing to take his plane out. So we get in the plane. It was quite a ride, let me tell you. Here he is with his headset on. Well, of course, the Rio Grande doesn't go in any kind of straight line. So you can't just set your course for your plane and go straight ahead. The Rio Grande goes like this and that and this and that. And so every few minutes over our headset, we were getting, sir, you are not authorized to enter Mexican airspace. Please assume a heading of 34 degrees north and 65 degrees west. Do so immediately. You will be asked to blah, blah, blah. So we couldn't concentrate a whole lot on looking down because we had to concentrate on not getting ourselves thrown in a Mexican jail. And, they probably thought we were there to drop drugs or something. So, lesson number 1. Habitat restoration requires an experience of with the natural history of a place, what was actually there. By the time I was working here at the Valley Nature Center, a whole lot of what was near the Rio Grande had already been destroyed. Of course, it had been farmed for many years because the Rio Grande was the source of water. So anybody who needed to farm or needed to raise cattle or sheep or whatever they were raising, they needed to get water out of the Rio Grande. So things were very, very much altered from what was here in the 1800s. And this section that I have put pointed arrows on is talking about where the cypress, the Moctezuma cypress, where it occurred in the river at the time these explorers came. And that was surprising to me because most of these cypresses were growing out of the most rocky part of the river. It says that some of them were, it may not be in this, but some of them were like 14 or 15 feet below the water. So when we're thinking about restoring a place, a list of the plants isn't the real goal. The history of the interaction between the humans, the animals, and the environment, Ken would say other humans and other animals. He keeps me straight sometimes on that. That answers the question of what has been lost and what might be restored. So these earliest writings are things which should not be lost, but they are. Most of the books I have I got them because somebody was throwing them out. A library was throwing them out. People used to find them in the dumpsters behind the library at Edinburgh. Dr. Richardson told me, and when I studied with him in Brownsville, he said most of our plant books have either been stolen or they've been thrown out. They had very little in their library at the time I studied there. This is still happening. Now, any of these books that are on that, well, not any, but most, if you tried to buy them online, you'd be paying a couple of $100 for them, if you could find them at all. So those of you young people who are, visiting libraries, keep your eyes open for these old books about plants, because not all of this stuff is on the internet. There's a lot of stuff out there, and there's a lot of stuff out there that's wrong, but we need to keep these old resources. Ken and I were hoping when this new building was built that there would be a dedicated library for botanical reference books. That has not happened. And I don't know that we have one yet in the Valley, so that's a challenge I give to you young students, is where can we establish a library, a comprehensive one, where these old treasures about botany are not going to be thrown out. I had just learned about putting moving objects in your presentation, and I have quite forgotten just where all of them are. Okay, so another one of these old records was by Emery, and this was from 1857 to 1859, so this is about 20 years after Berlandier was here. And this was a survey. The United States and Mexico wanted to survey what was on the boundary, and they decided that the Rio Grande would be the boundary. Well, I'm sure the Mexicans weren't too happy because they'd been living up in New Mexico, Arizona, California, Nevada, so suddenly the United States decides, okay, the Rio Grande is going to be our border. And they got away with it. And these are the falls that were described as where those very large Moctezuma cypress trees lived. That's of course, these drawings are from super old publications where the printing process was not so refined. So here's where Emery describes where he finds those cypress trees. And I met Bill McWhorter next to a big cypress tree. That was the first time I ever met him. So he and I had kind of a love affair with each other and also with the cypress tree. So I continued my endeavors to make the Valley Nature Center an engaging place where children could come and learn about things. And I kind of shoved Bill's preoccupation with these old books to the back of my mind. And pretty soon I waved goodbye to the Valley Nature Center, and I plunged into learning more about native plants, because I was starting to write a weekly article about native plants, so I needed to learn stuff real fast. So I met another botanical treasure, Dr. Alfred Richardson. At the time I met him, he had only written these 2 books, and mostly we tried to use his Rio Grande Delta book to identify plants in the class. And that collection of old books over there on that table is a direct reflection of Dr. Richardson, because in probably our second class, he brought in this huge collection of all these botanical tomes. And, I looked through them and I thought, well, gosh, they don't have too many pictures in here. And some of them, I can't understand most of the words, but I figured he knew what he was doing. Now, this was before he met Ken King, and this is before they started Plants of Deep South Texas. And in his class, we were supposed to bring in native plants every week for identification. He was thrilled to have me in the class because these other kids were bringing in hibiscus, oleander, bougainvillea, and I was bringing in some stuff he couldn't identify. It was stuff I was finding around on the arroyo banks. And so we would try to identify it from his book, and we couldn't. So he brought in Correll and Johnson. And I thought, okay, let's see what this is all about. That thing will make you into a weightlifter if you use it very often. Here's an example of what do they say about our velvet lantana. And oh my gosh, there's too many big words in there. Ken knows these words. There's maybe, I don't know, Joey probably knows these words, but the ones I could understand were yellow, big, edible, and dry soil. So I was pretty much lost, but I came to really love this book. because it includes some stuff that you have to have a lot of room to incorporate in a book, and I don't know if we'll be able to get all this stuff into the new edition of Plants of Deep South Texas. We'll try. But it often includes description of the roots, which, okay, if you're going to go out and try to rescue a plant, it sure helps if you know what the root looks like, right? And how deep it's going to go, and how fat it should be, and how far out the other roots should stretch out. This also includes the plant's range around the world, which is a super important thing. A lot of our plants live all the way around the world, especially the ones which live near the coast, because anywhere there's a coast where there's a similar kind of temperature range and soils, those plants are going to survive. So now I have my own copy of Corral and Johnson, and I use it pretty often. I have to skip about half the words unless I spend the whole night on the dictionary or the Google, but it's helpful. So my keep has been a great help to me, but I started thinking he was fixated on the past as well, and I started to worry about it. He started talking about this book he was reading, and the content sounded questionable to me. It didn't seem like it had jokes or much of a plot, and nothing in the way of romance. So it was not like the books I was used to reading. When he showed me the cover of it, I thought, oh my good grief. Doesn't that cover just want to make you snuggle up with it in bed for a cozy read? So I was getting ready to travel. It wasn't too heavy. He loaned it to me, and being in an airplane is so boring, I figured maybe I can read this while I'm on the plane. Well, this guy Lindheimer faced quite a task. You know, many plants we have are named Lindheimeri. Well, he was kind of boonswoggled into coming down to the upper Texas coast with a bunch of other Germans. And of course, the people who organized this said, oh, we're sending you plenty of money, you'll have plenty of food, there's plenty of building materials, you guys are going to get on great. Well, they got down here and they had practically nothing. And what he was supposed to be doing was going out and collecting plants that hadn't been seen before, pressing them, keeping them dry, and mailing them up to George Engelman, who was up in St. Louis at the Morton Arboretum. Well, the mail was so slow, he subscribed to the newspapers. They would get there 2 months late, but they would charge him, even back in those days, like $2 to get one newspaper through the mail. So he had quite a hard task. Well, there wasn't any romance I could find, but there was some sex involved, because he made a friend, and this friend had a daughter who was old enough to cook and sew and wash and do laundry and, clean the house. And so I think he asked Lindheimer for about $250 or something to marry his daughter as the dowry for all this work she was going to do for him. And they had a bunch of kids, so there had to be sex involved. But I didn't get any hints of romance when I read the book. He made friends with the local Amerindians. They found him very agreeable, and they showed him useful plants and told him what they were used for, and they saved him from a bunch of disasters. He was in an old wagon, probably with wooden wheels, and a lot of times they had to dig him up out of the mud so he could get back home. So this is pretty interesting. Can you imagine, going out God knows where, you'd never been there, you probably didn't have a map for the place, and I'd be lost and snake bitten on the first day, I'm sure. So before I actually got down to reading the book, I was coming up with schemes. I thought, well, maybe if I volunteered to babysit a lot for my keep's son, Matthew, then maybe he'll realize I'm too busy to read that book. Well, it turns out Mike and Claire loved that little guy so much, they didn't even want to farm him out for babysitting. Can you imagine? So it seemed like Heap was falling back into the past with these other chaps, but as I read that book, I began to realize that what these dodgy characters were trying to tell me was worth thinking about and even worth sharing, so here we are. And this is what I think went through their minds a lot of the times when they dealt with me. Do you remember this song? Does this predate a lot of you? And all my words come back to me in shades of mediocrity. That was a famous song when I was growing up, but I won't attempt to sing it for you. I'm not that great of a singer. So, question 2, lesson 2 in this presentation is, I was also asking these guys to help me with how do we know if plants are native, naturalized, or invasive in this area? Where's the list? You know, well, there was a guy named Joe Ideker, and he was pretty brilliant. He probably had a list in his head. But what they were trying to let me know is we have to include all our resources to answer that question. There's no one place that you're going to find all these answers. Even if these books are old and musty and heavy and horrible to read, at that time, there was no publication that showed, described, or even listed every plant native to this area. I'll show you some of the errors that they pointed out to me. Bill used to look a lot at this Cactaceae by Britton and Rose. He was especially interested that there was accuracy in which cacti are native here. And at that time, Mike Heap, I believe, was involved in some revegetation projects. Refuges around here were making lists of what plants could be included there. And Mike had been stomping around these places for years, and he knew what kind of plants had grown there, and he saw that their lists were way too restrictive. So one of the things that Bill was very upset that people had left out is Selena Sirius spinulosus. And it occurs in Britton and Rose, an old book that I don't think I have, and it was reported from 1909. And you can see at the bottom that it was listed as being from southeastern Texas. Well, the newer, quote-unquote, books on cacti did not include this. Bill had it growing in his yard, so he knew it was not extirpated. This is a pretty good illustration of what it looks. Bad photo, but pretty good illustration. And Britton and Rose could be the only older publication which tells us that this cactus once lived here and may yet be found. And indeed, Ken had it growing in his yard. He brought pieces for us, so some of you may have it growing in your yards now. It's certainly a very beautiful cactus. Well, could it really be that difficult to make a checklist of all the vascular plants of Texas? Here's one that was published in 1990, and they considered this to be a comprehensive list. Well, what does it say about Sirius spinulosus? A new distribution record. Now, 1919 to 1923, how new is that, guys? Sorry, not quite accurate. So then in Vascular Plants of Texas from 1997, these guys say likely extirpated from Texas due to habitat destruction. Never anything but rare in Texas, probably. Well, it had not been extirpated because Bill had seen it on the banks of the Rio Grande at some point during his life. So creating a second edition of Plants of Deep South Texas is going to require a lot of digging. It's not going to be any kind of overnight easy process for those of you who keep saying, okay, when is it going to be out? When is it going to be out? It's going to take a lot of work, and not just from the internet. Also, this Cacti by Del Winninger, published in 1984, he left out Silena cereus as well. Now, there are some other good old publications on our native cacti. One was by Robert Runyon, who did this in 1930. He was an excellent photographer. His work is, a lot of it is on the Smithsonian website. He has a picture of that old railroad bridge that's adjacent to the thicket in Harlingen, which is a pretty cool thing to find a picture of that old bridge. So there are some other older publications on cacti that include good information specific to this area. Well, aren't these resources being properly safeguarded? Is this old book something I need to worry about? Well, perhaps so. As I believe I already gave my speech on how these things are being discarded from libraries. So please keep your eyes open for these old volumes. I have a lot of them spread over on that table. And for any of you who want these references, I can send you a PDF copy of this presentation if you just email me, so that you can be on the lookout for these books. This one was brought to me by a volunteer at the library. She was in the bookstore area where people brought in stuff to donate, and where the librarians were bringing stuff to discard. And so she would keep an eye out for these books and just give them to me. I don't know how the library at Edinburgh is now, because it's been many years ago since I took a course over there with Dr. Leonard. At the time, they had a pretty good library for botanical things. Oh, yeah, so this book, P.C. Stanley, is an excellent thing, Trees and Shrubs of Mexico, and this was from the U.S. National Herbarium. Our natives live in Mexico too. They cross the river. The birds fly across with a seed. Floods bring things back and forth. So this is a great volume, and I've used it. Whoops, why did I get to here suddenly? One of my slides is lost somewhere. We'll come up to it, hopefully. It's a slide about the yellow blooming olive tree. Okay, we, especially our current commander-in-chief, likes to think of the Mexicans as being very backward, and we like to think of ourselves as being superior. Well, I visited Cuernavaca, Mexico, an ethnobotanical garden and museum, and this was in their museum. I think my special effect will come up. Some of these plants they've been studying since 1552. Well, we don't exactly have written records for the US going back to 1552. I know the Spanish went to Santa Fe, in the 1400s, but they were not busy writing anything about plants. They were busy trying to murder the Indians and steal everything from them. So we're not ahead of Mexico much. This is the slide I was looking for. Dr. Richard Hoverson, who is now deceased, was growing this beautiful plant, which he just called the Mexican yellow olive. And when I got P.C. Stanley, that was the first chance I had to look for this and try to figure out what was the name of it. And what I found that the name was Cordia alba. I also found out that these sticky fruits that it makes have been used for all kinds of things, including sticking cigar wrappers closed. Now, isn't that cool? The chachalakas love to eat these berries. I don't usually plant things that are not from this area, but this plant is not freeze hardy. So it's not going to take over the world down here. And the birds certainly like to eat the fruits. We have 2 of these growing in Ramseyman Nature Park in Harlingen. And sometimes they've frozen back almost to the ground. So in addition to telling you where all in the world these plants grow, do I have a pointer on here? I'll just point. Up here he's telling all these places where it grows, describing what it looks like, telling what is the common name of it in each of these places that it grows, describing the wood, telling what you can do with the flowers medicinally. And since we're getting a new head of, what's he going to be head of? Kennedy, right? We're not going to have any medicines, guys, so we're going to have to start looking up our own remedies for everything that happens to us. So this book could turn out to be really very helpful. So that's P.C. Stanley's Trees and Shrubs of Mexico. I used to go to McAllen's library on 13th Street. I don't know if it's even there anymore, but it was too small to hide things. So all these botanical treasures they had in a locked cabinet, but they were right next to the librarian's desk. So I could just say to her, hey, could I look at these books for a few minutes? She'd say yes, she'd unlock it and hand them to me. So at that library, those books were actually being used. In other libraries, very often these books are way off somewhere, and hard to find where they are, hard to find the librarian to ask for permission to use them. And so why are they being discarded? Well, nobody's been checking them out or looking for them, so the librarians just decide that nobody is interested in them. Okay, so enough lessons. Copying Dr. Richardson. Why would it be magnificent to have these things more accessible? Well, for one thing, in Flora of Texas, which I just brought 1 volume here, they talk about Mortonia gregii, Athenador. It's one of my most favorite plants of all. And you have to go up on those high ridges out by Rio Grande City to find this plant. So it's hard to find the fruits. It's hard to be there at the right time to take cuttings. And when I show you a picture of it, isn't it lovely? It would be wonderful in anybody's yard. So some of these old books, he was already saying that this thing should be propagated many, many years ago. And we've had that as a goal, but we haven't attained that goal. Now, what is super good about this particular book is that it describes every place that people found these plants. So here, this first record that he lists is from 1933, and it was EU clover. All right, she found it on gravel and limestone hills in La Jolla in Hidalgo County. And so we start to develop a cast of characters of who is it going out and finding these plants, and where did they find them, and when did they do so. And I think Ken probably used a lot of this information to go look again for these populations to see if they could be found. So Bill McWhorter was very interested in EU clover. Her name is Elzada. And she wrote an amazing, well, she came down to the Rio Grande Valley. She did an amazing study. At the time, there was I guess the premier plant publication, botany publication, was Madroño. And she wrote an article that was printed in here. It occurred in, what year? 1937. And I'm going to show you some pictures from her book. or from her article, I should say. What she called her article was Vegetational Survey of the Lower Rio Grande Valley, Texas, 1937. Here is this lady traveling all over South Texas in 1937, probably in a Model T Ford by herself. Can you imagine all the flat tires that she must have gotten? Because this is a rough place to go exploring in. And so for years, she was definitely a role model for me. And Bill and I were always interested in finding out more about her. So thankfully, Google and the internet became available. We found a picture of her. And we found out that she had been a professor at the University of Michigan. She died at the age of 83 in San Juan. And Bill was so sad because he was here in 1980 when she died, and he could have met her if he only knew where she was. But there was no way in that time for him to find out. At the time I gave this presentation in 2005, most people had no idea how to use the internet. So I gave them these steps that you go to Google, you choose search the web. Now most of you could teach me a few more things than this. Go to image search, and then you hit copy and you hit paste. So we got some more pictures of her. Now, in her papers, she had a 2-volume journal from this expedition she went on. It was called the Neville's Colorado River Expedition. Since that time, there has been a book written, and a lot of the people in this room have probably read it. I listened to it on Audible. It was called Brave the Wild River, The Untold Story of Two Women Who Mapped the Botany of the Grand Canyon. It was published in 2023. Of course, she did that way before then. She had been dreaming of exploring the Grand Canyon to identify plants. She'd been wanting to do that for a long time. And so she persuaded her graduate student, Lois Jotter, the one in the circle is Elzada. I'm not sure which one is Lois Jotter. She persuaded her to come along. So they found this guy named Neville's, and he said, well, sure, I'll take you on the river. He was a river runner. So they were honored at the end of that trip as the only women in history to complete the perilous voyage. I like how they celebrated. They had rattlesnake steaks for their victory dinner, which I think was probably great. They probably had to kill a lot of rattlesnakes along the way, find them in their tents and sleeping bags. But this is an old story, and you men in the room may be tired of hearing it. The national papers followed this excursion as closely as they could, and many people complained that women were along on this journey. Why on earth were they going along? It was just purely for amusement, and they were just going to be a problem. Well, what did these women do? In addition to helping to load the boats, put them in the river, steer them around, save their compatriots who fell out of the boat, they also did all of the cooking, washing, collected their plants, pressed them, kept them dry somehow. And these boats had never been tested. This guy, he had never run the perilous rapids that he told them he would take them through, and he had never tested his boats. They were terribly heavy. They were not very seaworthy, and they lost at least one of those boats because it turned over. So here were these women who, so many people were complaining that they had gone on this voyage, and they did probably double the work of most of those men. Now, this is one of the maps that Elzada made for the valley, showing where major vegetation grew. She used the local Amerindian, Mexican American terms for places, like if there was a lot of mesquite, she called it a mesquital. If there was a lot of zacate, somewhere in here, she called it a zacatal. So she was very smart in realizing that these people who lived around all of these plants knew a heck of a lot more about them than she did as a first-time visitor. And she relied upon their knowledge and used that in her publication. She also did this map of geologic zones. Now, how on earth would you do that driving around in a Model T Ford? You know, pretty amazing that she, to me, that she could figure all of that out. So I've been very happy to have access to this work, and I'm very much in awe of Elzada. So she used things like amor for the bush morning glory, and she called places where a lot of them grew as an amoral. Dr. Vine's book is another one we cannot forget. All of the work, all of the illustrations are line drawings, but they're very well done. And his book is easy to read. It includes a lot of information, including a lot of vernacular names, medicinal and other uses, where the plant occurs. And for a long time, I never thought about it, including vines, but many of our vines are woody, so they are in this book. And this, I should go back. This book was copyrighted in 1960. It was reprinted 8 times. The last reprinting was 1994, so it's out of print. You can't get it anymore. Here's an example of what it looks like. He has Essenbeckia and Beretta on the same pages. So even plants that we think of as being rarer in here. Eyennia limitaris, which I don't even really think of as being woody, is included in his book. We can't leave out the wildflowers because Texas has a whole lot of them. And we have a lot of books about Texas wildflowers. One of my favorite is this one, Roadside Flowers of Texas. And the reason why is that they actually talk about the interaction of insects with the flowers. This section here, the whole section, is describing the pollination of the yucca plant. So I haven't read this whole book yet, but that's certainly one of my goals, because knowing how are those insects pollinating those wildflowers, that's a pretty important thing to know about. And while I was taking the course with Dr. Richardson, I was complaining to Mike Heap. I said, I can't figure out these keys. These keys drive me nuts. They're just incomprehensible. He said, well, pick up this book by Jones, Flora of the Coastal Bend. Jones knows how to make a key. You look at the first page of the key and you go, wow, I can figure this out. I know what the second step is going to be. So there are people who make keys that you can follow, and there are people who do not. And they have, quote unquote, updated this book. They charge more now for it. They include some color pictures, but they don't even identify what a lot of their color pictures are. So there's no point in spending more money for the updated version if you can find this old one somewhere. That's right, exactly. They do not give Jones credit, and practically 100% of the text in there is his. Okay, so this is all I have to torture you with today. You can find me on Facebook. My email address is up there, and this bitter tasting plant, amargosa, is one of my pseudonyms. And now that we're not going to have any medicines anymore, I'm going to be going out and finding that plant pretty often. It will take care of, let's see, what is it? amoebiasis, when you get amoeba, right? If you go to a physician, they'll give you 3 different medications to take care of amoeba. All 3 of them will make you sick. If you chew on the fruits of this plant, then you're cured, because in very tiny concentrations, the active ingredients in this plant will paralyze the amoeba, and they just pass through your system instead of invading the rest of your body, which is what they're very good at doing. Most people use the roots of this, and I think that's probably because you could dig up the root, put it in a jar in your pantry, label what it was, and when you needed it, you could make tea out of it. You didn't have to go out in the brush looking for it. But I know where to find it at Ramsey Park, so I just chew on the fruit. So thank you very much for your attention, and if you have questions, you'll just have to ask Ken.